This story unfolds in the United Kingdom in the year 2025. Ian Watkins was born on July 30th, 1977, in Wales. His father passed away when he was only 5 years old, and just 3 years after that, his mother remarried, this time to a Baptist minister. From everything we know, his childhood was stable, which makes it hard to pinpoint exactly where things took such a dark turn. As a teenager, Ian went to high school where he became friends with his future bandmate, Mike Lewis. The two of them connected over a shared passion for music, and because of this bond, they started their own band, the Lost Prophets. Ian took on the role of lead singer, and over the course of the next decade, the band skyrocketed to international fame, racking up multiple chart-topping hits and selling millions of albums. By the year 2012, they had released 5 studio albums and toured all over the world. On the surface, everything seemed to be going incredibly well. The band performed what would be their final show in November of 2012, having no idea it would be their last one. Only weeks later, Ian was arrested and charged with a series of shocking offenses that sent waves of horror through his fan base, his bandmates, and frankly, the entire world. Police in South Wales had served a drug warrant at his home, back in September of 2012. But what they found instead were computers and phones loaded with evidence of his disturbing appetite for watching, the innocence of children being stolen in the most horrific ways imaginable. To be perfectly honest, it's difficult to even speak about the nature of what Ian had done, and what he was planning to do. Picture the most depraved acts being forced upon the most vulnerable among us. Investigators uncovered recorded videos, images, and messages that documented his own unspeakable crimes against minors. But it didn't stop there. Ian had leveraged his celebrity status to manipulate young women in order to get to their children, and horrifyingly, some mothers willingly offered them up. His computer password was, "I love her kids." A single terabyte can store 472 hours of video. Ian was found to be in possession of 27 terabytes of this monstrous material. His youngest victim was just 11 months old. In court, he eventually pleaded guilty to 13 offenses, including the violation of minors, and conspiring to commit the most depraved acts imaginable on a fan's baby, at the mother's own urging. The specifics of these crimes are truly too stomach-churning to describe, but it's enough to know he represents the absolute worst of humanity. Ian was ultimately sentenced to 29 years behind bars, a sentence which many feel was far too light. He alleged he had no recollection of his extensive criminal past, blaming his substance abuse for leading him astray. His lifelong friends in the Lost Prophets publicly denounced him and immediately broke up the band following his conviction. The singer, who was once so adored, was now locked away in a cell inside what's known as Monster Mansion, the infamous high-security prison, HMP Wakefield. This facility holds murderers, serial killers, and predators of his very same kind. By all accounts, Ian kept a calm and confident demeanor during his first few months in prison. He generally kept to himself, spending hours in his cell writing letters and song lyrics. But his reputation as one of the most evil figures in modern British history put a massive target on his back. Other inmates looked at him with absolute disgust. A former prisoner stated, "Watkins was basically a dead man walking, from the second he set foot in Wakefield. Everybody knew what he did. You just don't last long in a place like that, when your crimes are against kids." He was officially classified as a vulnerable prisoner because of the nature of his offenses, and was initially placed under strict protective custody. Psychologists who evaluated him described him as arrogant and completely without remorse. In fact, while he was waiting to be sentenced, he dismissed the entire case against him as mega lols, a British slang term for a huge joke. But over time in prison, he began to suffer from severe anxiety and depression. As the grim reality of his situation finally sank in, he was put on medication for panic attacks, and told the court that he found life behind bars to be extremely difficult. Ian's only comfort, it seemed, was his music. He kept on writing songs and would tell anyone who'd listen how much he missed performing, and longed for the celebrity lifestyle. Within just a few years of his imprisonment, Ian's infamy had earned him a great deal of hatred from within the prison walls. However, this notoriety also drew a disturbing level of obsession from certain admirers on the outside. He was inundated with hundreds of pages of mail from women, with many of the letters containing graphic and unsolicited material, and even marriage proposals. There were also reports of so-called groupies visiting him in prison, and accounts alleged that he was permitted to kiss them. In March of 2018, prison staff received a tip that Ian might be concealing a contraband cell phone. Acting on this intelligence, guards conducted a surprise search of Ian's cell and a strip search of his person. Initially, he denied possessing any forbidden items, but when the officers threatened to put him in solitary confinement, Ian reluctantly produced a tiny 3-inch G-Star mobile phone he had hidden inside his body. The phone's call logs later revealed that the device had been used to contact one of Ian's former admirers, a woman named Gabriella who he had known prior to his arrest. When confronted, Ian claimed he hadn't used the device for his own purposes at all. Instead, he insisted that he was being forced to hold the phone for other inmates, for 2 other prisoners who intended to prey upon the women writing to him. Ian alleged that if he refused their demand, these inmates would have him killed. While under oath, Ian refused to identify the prisoners, stating, "I like my head on my body." As a result, he received an additional 10-month prison sentence, added to his existing 30-year term, for the cell phone incident. Following this, Ian was transferred to a different section of the prison where, he claimed, he would be killed if he ever let his guard down. Despite heightened security measures, the threats against Ian continued to escalate. By the middle of 2023, tensions within the prison corridors had reached a critical boiling point. Then, on the morning of August 5, 2023, Ian's routine walk from the medical wing back to his cell was violently cut short. 3 inmates, armed with shanks, ambushed him and dragged him into a cell on the spur wing. They barricaded the door, taking Ian hostage. For the next 6 hours, the 46-year-old inmate was at the mercy of his captors, who seemingly relished the opportunity to do him harm. It would take a team of riot-trained tactical officers and expert negotiators to finally bring the standoff to an end. Late that afternoon, officers breached the barricaded cell. They deployed stun grenades to disorient the attackers as the tactical team stormed in, where they found Ian on the cell floor, covered in blood. He had been beaten and stabbed multiple times with a sharpened weapon, but miraculously, he was still alive. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital with serious injuries to his abdomen and neck, but none of the wounds proved to be immediately life-threatening. Ian spent the next several days in the hospital under armed guard. Meanwhile, his attackers were placed in solitary confinement, pending an official investigation. News of the attack made headlines across the United Kingdom, with many openly speculating how much longer Ian could survive inside the walls of Wakefield prison. After recovering from his injuries, Ian returned to prison and was placed in protective segregation. Remarkably, he did not request a transfer to a different facility. By the fall of 2025, he had spent nearly a decade behind bars. He was known for being extremely cautious, rarely interacting with other inmates, and he followed all prison rules, hoping to avoid any further conflict. Yet, he seemed to sense what was on the horizon. Ian once reportedly said, "It's not like a one-on-one fight. Chances are, someone would just sneak up behind me and slit my throat. I won't see it coming." Then, on a Friday evening in October of 2025, Ian placed a phone call to his mother. In a trembling voice, he told her he loved her and that he was okay. However, the call was strangely emotional, and his mother would later recall that it almost felt like a final goodbye. Shortly after 9 a.m., on October 11th, 2025, Wakefield Prison was stirring to life. Cell doors on F-Wing were being unlocked for the morning routine, as inmates shuffled out to get their breakfast or make phone calls. Inside one cell, however, a violent confrontation was breaking out. Several prisoners had slipped into Ian Watkins' cell and launched a frenzied attack. One of the assailants was armed with a makeshift knife. He drove the blade directly into Ian's neck, while a second inmate stood watch at the doorway, standing watch while Ian struggled with his assailant. Blood spattered across the cell's walls and floor as Ian went down from the brutal assault. He managed to cry out for help only once, but that single scream caught the attention of a corrections officer patrolling the tier. When the officer reached the cell, he was confronted with a horrifying scene. Ian was on the floor, clutching his neck as blood poured from the wound. The officer immediately hit the emergency alarm, and within moments, more prison staff converged on the cell. Corrections staff rushed to Ian's side, trying to stop the profuse bleeding from a puncture wound just below his jawline. An ambulance was called, but it was already too late. Ian had no pulse and was unresponsive. He was pronounced dead right there in his cell. News of the attack triggered an immediate prison-wide lockdown. By early afternoon, his body was removed from the facility, and a high-profile investigation was already underway. Investigators quickly identified two primary suspects, one 25 years old and the other 45. They were arrested right inside the prison on suspicion of murder and taken into police custody for interrogation. Neither suspect offered any immediate statement to detectives, but by Monday, October 13th, the police had gathered enough evidence to charge both inmates with the murder of Britain's most infamous criminal. Court documents identified them as 25-year-old Rashid Guidel and 43-year-old Samuel Dodsworth. The charges were announced to the public in a police press release. On October 21st, 2025, police made 2 more arrests in the case. 2 unnamed men, ages 23 and 39, who were also inmates at Wakefield, were taken into custody on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder. Investigators believe these men might have helped plan the attack or assisted the other 2 in some capacity. Both men were questioned and later sent back to the prison population while the investigation continued. Not much is publicly known about these 2 individuals. However, we do know more about the 2 primary assailants. Rashid was a 25-year-old from East London, whose early life was defined by instability and violence. He spent time in foster care as a young teen, and by his mid-teens, he was already involved with street gangs. By the time he was 20, he had earned a reputation as an unpredictable and dangerous gang member, known for his willingness to use extreme violence. On February 6, 2021, Rashid participated in a vicious gang assault in northwest London. He was part of a group of 6 men who ambushed 2 strangers outside a bakery in broad daylight. The 6 assailants chased down 22-year-old Sven Bazdek, tackling him to the sidewalk and stabbing him repeatedly as he lay helpless on the ground. Sven's 16-year-old friend, who was also stabbed and severely wounded, managed to escape with his life. It turned out to be a tragic case of mistaken identity. Neither of the victims had any connection to gangs, and were simply targeted for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, in an area that Rashid and his crew considered their territory. Rashid was arrested and charged with murder in August of 2023, following a trial at the Old Bailey. He was convicted of murder. He was transferred to Wakefield Prison in late 2023, and by the time his path crossed with Ian Watkins, Rashid had only been incarcerated for about 2 years, and within the rigid hierarchy of the prison system, he might have viewed the notorious Ian Watkins as a high-profile target, someone to be taken out, both for personal notoriety and as a twisted source of pride. His official motives, however, remain unknown. Samuel Dodsworth, at 43 years old, was the older of Ian's 2 attackers. He hailed from the city of Derby in the Midlands region of England, and his own history is deeply disturbing. In the pre-dawn hours of September 3, 2018, Samuel committed a crime so savage that a judge later compared it to something out of a horror movie. The 36-year-old Samuel was prowling the streets of Derby when he zeroed in on a lone woman who was on her way to work before sunrise. The victim was a 52-year-old stranger who just happened to be in his path at that moment. Samuel attacked her from behind, dragging the woman off the street and into a nearby abandoned house. He threatened to end her life if she screamed. For the next several minutes, Samuel subjected the innocent woman to a horrific ordeal of beating, choking, and repeated sexual violation. She would later testify in court that she was absolutely convinced she was going to. For a brief moment, Samuel's vigilance lapsed. Seizing the opportunity, she escaped, partially clothed, onto the street where a passing motorist came to her aid and contacted law enforcement. She would later recount an uncontrollable urge to cleanse herself in the aftermath. Within hours, Samuel Dodsworth was taken into custody, and while detained, his demeanor was described as cold and utterly without remorse. Samuel eventually pleaded guilty to a slate of charges: kidnapping, false imprisonment, and 5 counts of sexual assault. At Derby Crown Court in December of 2018. For the attack, he was sentenced to 24 years in prison. The presiding judge highlighted the exceptionally degrading and violent character of his offense, ruling that Samuel would be ineligible for parole consideration until he had served a minimum of 2/3 of his sentence. By the time of Ian's murder, he had already served approximately 7 years of his sentence. Exactly how and why Rashid and Samuel conspired to attack Ian remains a central question in this investigation. The pair had few apparent connections and shared little common ground, aside from a marked propensity for extreme and unsettling violence. The legal process for Ian's murder commenced almost immediately after the suspects were formally charged on a Monday, October 13, 2025. Under a heavy security detail, Rashid and Samuel were arraigned separately at Leeds Magistrate Court. Both men spoke only to confirm their names, ages, and dates of birth. Their trial was scheduled for May 5, 2026. with an estimated duration of up to 3 weeks. In light of the anticipated evidence, as of late October 2025, neither man had entered a plea. The news of Ian's violent end garnered little public sympathy. Ian had long been seen as the personification of evil, a rock star turned predator whose offenses were widely considered beyond forgiveness. Many observers openly voiced their relief that he would never again be a free man. The fact that he met a brutal end behind bars gave many a sense that justice had finally been served. Back in his hometown in Wales, his death was marked by an absence of vigils or flowers, leaving only the painful memories of the shame he had brought upon the community.